Meeting order. The treasurer walked in, and we got to get going. Thank you all for attending, and for the hundreds of thousands that are watching this on television, thank you for joining us this morning. Together with Chairman Gomez of the Assembly Appropriations Committee, this is a joint legislative hearing between the Committee on Governance and Finance and the Assembly Committee on Appropriations, as is required under Senate Bill 1253. Today, the first of such hearings, we are here to discuss and consider a measure that has been submitted to be qualified for the November 9th, 2016 ballot. Before I start, I want to again thank the Chairman and his staff for their work in this regard, a particularly talented staff, Mr. Pedro Reyes. And also both Speaker Atkins and incoming Speaker Rendon, as well as Speaker Pro Tem Kevin De Leon, for their assistance in helping guiding this very first such hearing. Now, for me, ladies and gentlemen, this is an exciting and important day because it is the first of such hearings, and I worked very hard on the passage of SB 1253 that requires the legislature to be notified whenever an initiative in circulation has gathered 25% of the signatures to qualify for the ballot. This allows the legislature at a time when it is considering policy matters to intersect with the process earlier than what we've seen in the past, and that these hearings, instead of being infomercials, if you will, just matters of weeks before a ballot measure is to be considered by the voters, that there's really some interactive interrelationship between the important historical role of the legislative branch of government and proponents of the very important notion of initiatives. And I just want to reference Section 2 of 1253, where the purpose of this hearing, again quite different, is to identifying and correcting flaws in the initiative measure before it appears on the ballot. And also the language specifically goes on, by extending the time for gathering signatures, this act would give the legislature the opportunity to hold early public hearings to review initiative measures. The act would allow the proponents of an initiative appropriately to withdraw the measure after the petition and signatures are submitted to the election officials, but before the measure qualifies for the ballot. So it is a quite unique and different process. And so we start today with that notion of really examining this measure before us. And we start with the Treasurer of California, John Cheung, who is charged with the responsibility of issuing debt, managing debt for California, to provide his thoughts and insights with respect to this measure. Mr. Treasurer.
We are here as required to analyze the potential effects of the passage of the so-called no-claim checks initiative. It is qualified to go before voters on the November general election ballot. As state treasurer, I am the agent for sale for all general obligation and revenue bonds.
Is your mic on? You know what? I have to think. You know, performance treasurer, I apologize. You know, I'm used to I'm not used to co-chairing committees. I want to offer the chair of the Appropriations Committee an opportunity to make a quick opening. I apologize for that, sir.
It was no offense. None of your bills will be held that shouldn't be held in appropriations, anyways. But no, I want to thank everybody for participating in this first hearing. It's first of its kind, and let's make sure that it actually serves the purpose that the legislature intended when we passed the bill, which was to vet out initiatives to make sure that people understand what is going to be put on the ballot, what are the flaws, what are the strengths, and then maybe even if we ever get crazy enough, to replace it. But it's really just kind of how do we vet these initiatives in a very thoughtful way. So, Mr. Hertzberg, back to you.
Mr. Treasurer, back to you. Again, my apologies, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you kindly. I'll proceed from where I left off. As State Treasurer, I am the agent of sale for all general obligation and revenue bonds issued by the state. In that role, my office sells revenue bonds from the Department of Water Resources, the University of California, the California State University, and a number of other agencies. We also sell revenue bonds on behalf of the state's conduit authorities, which issue revenue bonds for private and nonprofit borrowers. These include colleges, hospitals, charter schools, and pollution control facilities. Proceeds from revenue bonds sold by my office fund a variety of private business activities that support the state's economy as well as the critical infrastructure needs. The needs are growing constantly. Just last year, California Forward, a private sector think tank focusing on California's future, estimated that the Golden State should invest nearly $900 billion in transportation, school infrastructure, water improvements over the next decade. In 2012, the American Society of Civil Engineers found that 34% of California's roads are in poor condition and more than 2,700 bridges are structurally deficient. The governor's latest 5-year infrastructure plan estimates the state's deferred maintenance costs at over $77 billion. That is why I applaud this committee for convening today's hearing to review this proposal, which could significantly impact our ability to issue revenue bonds to pay for major public works. Before I go further, Chairman Hertzberg mentioned that I should provide a brief explanation of the difference between general obligation bonds and revenue bonds issued by the state. General obligation bonds are secured by the full faith and credit of California and are repaid out of the state's general revenues. The state constitution requires voter approval before the state can issue general obligation bonds. Some examples of programs funded by general obligation bonds are K-12 schools, higher education facilities, water projects, children's hospitals, and highways and other transportation projects. On the other hand, revenue bonds issued by the state are secured by a specific and identified revenue source, typically fees and other charges assessed on the users of projects financed by the bonds. State revenue bonds financed with state revenue bonds currently do not require voter approval. Some examples of programs financed with state revenue bonds are the State Water Project, the University of California and CSU systems, veterans housings, and various revolving loan programs. Now let's move to the initiative. There's an old Chinese saying that the best place to begin is the beginning. So let's start with an overview of the initiative's key parts. It would require voter approval of all revenue bonds issued or sold by the state in the amount singly or in the aggregate over $2 billion. Any project must be financed, owned, operated, or managed by the state. State is defined by the state of California, any of its agencies or departments, and any joint powers authority or similar body created by the state or in which the state is a member. State does not include local agencies, school districts, special districts, or community college districts. A single project may not be divided into separate projects to avoid the single voter approval requirement. Multiple projects constitute a single project where the separate projects are physically or geographically proximate to each other. The separate projects will be physically connected to each other, or one separate project cannot accomplish its stated purpose without completion of another separate project. It has been reported by the press that the proponents of the No Blank Checks initiatives are primarily concerned with obtaining voter approval for the California Water Fix, also known as the Delta Tunnels, and for any future revenue bond financing for the high-speed rail project. These two projects could definitely be impacted by the initiative. The California Water Fix is anticipated to be financed with $15 billion or more in revenue bonds. The current draft business plan for high-speed rail anticipates in excess of $5 billion in financing by revenues from cap-and-trade credit auctions. But half a century of ballot box lawmaking show that initiatives oftentimes create unintended consequences. This is particularly important to understand in the case of the No Blank Checks initiative. Key provisions are undefined. The upshot is that the projects that proponents never intended to affect could be covered by this initiative. The resulting disputes could wind up in the court as part of a lengthy and costly lawsuit. Prolonged litigation creates ambiguity and complexity in ways the state finances critical infrastructure.
major credit rating agencies have been aware of this phenomenon. They have commented almost 100 times in the past decade about how the initiative process injects uncertainty into the state's financing and budgeting. And they have generally viewed this as a credit negative, which risks greater costs of borrowing to the state. In an earlier comment on no blank checks, Fitch Ratings stated it would constrain infrastructure financing and likely result in reduced investment over time, particularly for major water projects. Proposition 218 provides a recent example of the risk of unintended consequences. Passed in 1996, Proposition 218 requires voter approval of taxes. The proposition declared that any fee passed without a voter mandate can be collected if directly tied to the value of the government service received by the payer. Almost 20 years later, after it was passed, the same proposition spawned an unforeseeable situation when courts ruled that local agencies could not charge tiered rates to encourage conservation by billing water hogs more than normal consumers. With the law of unintended consequences in mind, I've asked my staff to analyze the initiative for the purposes of identifying the types of projects that may be impacted. Here's what the preliminary analysis has found. The Department of Water Resources has issued revenue bonds for the state water project. The system of dams, water storage, aqueducts, pumping stations, and electric generation facilities was constructed to develop a water supply and convey water to areas in need. To date, the project has been financed with more than $10 billion in revenue bonds. DWR says it needs an additional $1.1 billion in revenue bond financing to complete existing projects. These figures do not include the proposed Delta tunnels or other dams and water storage projects that are being contemplated. Thus, additional debt could be subject to a statewide vote. The initiative may also have an impact on bridges and roads. For example, most bridges in California are owned by the state. If significant retrofitting or reconstruction is needed, voter approval may be required. If the damage is caused by an earthquake or natural disaster, the state will need to borrow money for repairs, or likely will need. Federal government financial assistance could turn out to be insufficient or delayed. Even short-term borrowing, such as commercial paper, used for interim financing pending reimbursement from the federal government, might be threatened. Whether identified for campus-specific or system-wide projects, future public higher education projects may be subject, and I underscore may be subject, to the initiative. At the campus level, it is possible for that total revenue bonds issued for the various projects to meet student growth and to update facilities eventually could exceed the $2 billion threshold. At the system level, it is possible that one or both of the university systems could get sideways with the initiative's issuance limits. For instance, what if the UC system wanted to consolidate all of its dormitory facilities into a system-wide financing? Due to the lack of clarity of the initiative, it is possible these types of finances would require voter approval. Given the interconnectedness of the prison healthcare system, revenue bonds issued to finance elements of that system could require voter approval. When a statewide conduit financing authority, such as the California Health Facilities Financing Authority, issues bonds for the benefit of private or nonprofit borrowers, these bonds could be subject to the initiative. I note that this authority have 5 borrowers that each have issued in excess of $2 billion of revenue bonds. As a result, the initiative could impose obligations or limitations on the ability of these borrowers to access tax-exempt bond financing through a state conduit financing authority, even though the borrower that has the sole responsibility for the debt service payments is a private entity. In recent years, the state has engaged in securitization financings in which bonds were issued based on future anticipated revenues. The proceeds of these bonds help the state meet existing budgetary needs. Tobacco bonds are an example. Similarly, future efforts may need voter approval if the initiative passes. So based on my office's preliminary review of the initiative and analysis of the types of projects that I've already discussed, I believe the No Blank Checks initiative raises a number of thorny questions that this committee should explore. Those include the following. The initiative risks an erosion or distortion of local control over fiscal decisions. Many projects that may hit the threshold have no statewide impact, even though they are financed or owned by the state. For instance, should voters in all parts of the state have a say if we decide to replace the Coronado Bridge and pay for it with revenue bonds paid by tolls, mainly from San Diego motorists? By requiring a statewide vote on such a project, the initiative might erode local control of projects that may have only a regional impact, making it more costly and difficult for those projects to be built. The initiative may also lead to the state losing flexibility in times of disasters or crisis. There is often no certainty regarding alternative funding sources when costly emergencies occur. During the electric power crisis of the early 2000s, the state issued $11.3 billion of revenue bonds through the Department of Water Resources to keep the lights on. A statewide election could delay a quick and effective response to a man-made or natural calamity. It would take a year or more for a statewide vote. Even under normal circumstances, let alone emergency situations, such a delay would increase costs and uncertainties. By allowing the threshold to be met by boards issued in the aggregate for a project, this initiative fails to recognize the concept of life cycle financing. The initiative specifically places its $2 billion threshold on bonds issued singly or in aggregate for a project. In many cases, a project is built and then some years later renovated or expanded with additional financing. For example, what if a bridge is constructed for $1.2 billion in revenue bond financing and 15 years later renovations are needed that will cost another $1 billion? Does the aggregate amount require voter approval for the second financing? The initiative does not include an exception for bonds issued to refund or refinance existing debt. Last year, my office refinanced more than $4.5 billion in previously issued revenue bonds. The resulting savings to California is more than $600 million. Simply issuing refunding bonds to lower borrowing costs could require voter approval if the aggregate amount of the refunding bonds, combined with the already issued bonds on the project, exceed $2 billion. The initiative provides that the $2 billion threshold will be adjusted to reflect increases in the Consumer Price Index. But consumer prices are a poor proxy for construction costs on public projects, which typically increase at a higher rate. A project that cost $200 million 50 years ago could cost as much as 10 times that amount today, simply as a result of inflation. That same scenario would apply going forward. The initiative creates uncertainty regarding how large infrastructure projects will be financed in the future. Given the connection between the state's economy and the state's extensive infrastructure needs, any uncertainty regarding how those needs will be financed may result in higher interest rates. As I mentioned earlier, Fitch warned that the initiative could hamper crucial investments. Constraining financing and reducing investments is costly and an impediment to fixing our crumbling public works. In summary, the reason my office's analysis remains preliminary is because key provisions in the measure are ill-defined and ambiguous. We struggle to understand what projects are in and what projects are out. Therefore, we believe many of the questions raised by the initiative will only be resolved through litigation and judicial interpretation of these uncertain provisions. If history is prologue, these are the types of circumstances that are the breeding ground for unintended consequences and the injection of complexity and uncertainty into the state's financing and budgeting.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. Questions from the members? Assemblymember Eggman.
Thank you very much for that presentation. So I hear a lot of this may cause a problem, this might affect this, and this may cause a problem, this might affect this. So there's a lot of unknown out there. And given that, I guess my question is are there ever projects that do have statewide impact that we should vote on?
Well, that is a matter of decision by the voters, or appropriately also those policymakers that are involved with that. So, yes, debt financing is a critical option. It's a critical financing tool. As we proceed going forward, we want to make sure that not only do we keep those tools available, but perhaps expand the opportunities that we have available in California's tool.
So there are some projects that we are looking at financing with revenue bonds that potentially could go to the voters if there is a statewide impact.
Yes.
Okay. So let's talk about the elephant in the room, the Delta tunnels. Has a statewide impact. We're looking at least a starting price tag of $17 billion. The voters voted on this project in 1982 and voted it down. Should not the voters have the opportunity to weigh in on this specific project?
Yeah, so the question is, I understand your question. My question is not whether the voters should have it. The question is, if we bring it to the market, do we have the certainty? Do we have the legal certainty? Do we have the fiscal certainty? Do we understand the costs? And do we have all the unresolved issues answered before we perhaps take it to the ballot?
On this particular initiative, or like I have a bill 1713, AB 1713, that would say on the Delta project in specific, on the tunnels that the voters rejected in 1982, and that we're going to have ratepayers pay for, who are voters, who are Californians. Should they not have the opportunity on this giant specific project, that is the elephant in the room, to weigh in on that?
Yeah, so I have no objections to the voters. Right, I just want to make sure that the preceding issues that I raised are all identified, right? Because you don't want to have uncertainty into the market, obviously, because you don't want those issues ultimately have to be resolved by a court of law. So the pricing becomes more undetermined. At the end of the day, it probably increases the cost to the taxpayers of California. It not only has an impact for that particular issuance, right, if they see that pattern and practice engaged in by the state of California, it will raise other questions about issuance by the state of California.
For revenue bonds for $17 billion projects?
For any of these.
For any project. So again, you were talking generally, and I guess my question was in specific. On a project that voters have already denied in 1982, that will have, and it is not a regional issue, it's not a bridge, it will go from the top of California to the bottom of California, that is statewide. Should voters not have the opportunity to know that they're going to be paying for that and have the opportunity to have a voice?
So just so that we have clarification, ratepayers and voters are not necessarily synonymous, right? So and so you have to think about...
Okay, but vote payers living in the state of California, ratepayers who live in the state of California, whether they can vote or not, are still Californians who will see their water bills go up and potentially their property tax bills go up with this project.
So right, and I think we're trying to address you're talking about a specific issue.
I am.
I'm talking about general...
Right, yes, right. Your role as treasurer
for the state, right? So I'm not commenting on the particular merits of any given.
I just wanted to raise the issue that we're talking in a lot of generalities and may and might and regional, but if we're talking about a statewide issue, that it just seems to me that the voters, the ratepayers, should have the opportunity to weigh in on it.
Mr. Bell and Mr. Morlock, I just wanted to share on that point that maybe that is the elephant in the room. I don't know. What's before us is a proposition that dramatically impacts the state in all these different iterations, and the question is, if that was the case, maybe they should just simply do an initiative on whatever particular issue someone's concerned about, rather than, I think, as you'll see, fundamentally disturb just an array of issues, number of which the treasurer pointed out, from the days of the energy crisis to whether it's earthquakes or local construction or the like. That's the question, and what's the impact going to be with respect to the measure that's going to be before the voters now? So, Senator Bell.
Just generally, can you describe the credit standing at the present time of the state of California?
So we have split ratings. We have AA minus by a couple of them, right, and then we have a lower rating by another ratings agencies. We've increased over the past couple of years. At one point, we were at the lowest for investment grade for the state. So we're making progress, but we're still 48th of 50 states.
So what is your expectation that this initiative would have on credit rating of the state?
So I don't want to speculate, but as I commented, there has been concerns about what Fitch stated. As I also pointed out, they are concerned about our structural handcuffs that we continue to place in the state of California, creating greater inability to respond, especially during emergency situations. And so they want the state to have as much financial flexibility to address whatever the needs are at any given moment in time, at any given point in time.
And that kind of leads to my other question. Would this initiative constrain revenue bonds that were intended to repair and respond to short-term or long-term emergencies due to destruction of infrastructure, other kinds of damage that could occur from various places like floods, earthquakes, to repair and reconstruct facilities that might be damaged due to those kinds of incidents and catastrophes that could occur?
It certainly could, right? If you have to put it back before the voters, we're uncertain about whether we receive assistance from other entities, right? Because you pointed out, Senator Bell, the natural disasters. There's also man-made disasters, whether it's, as Senator Hertzberg well knows, the Enron crisis, the financial crisis of 2008, and so how Hurricane Katrina, how others may respond. And so the fact that we may need immediate access to the market may be hampered should this go forward.
Thank you.
Senator Morlock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. May I direct my questions to Timothy Schaefer? Sure. He's from Orange County, and I trust him.
Yes.
Mr. Schaefer, we were handed out this sheet of almost 32 billion of revenue bonds. Are the revenues from these various projects, are they paying the principal and interest on a timely basis?
Yes, they are, Senator.
And are we subsidizing any of those payments from the general fund?
I don't believe we are. If there are any subsidies, it would be very minor in amount. The pledge here is of specific revenues. There's no general fund involvement here.
And then, has this state ever had, and I could ask you both, I'm just having a little fun, okay, Mr. Treasurer, just picking on an old friend. Mm-hmm. But are there any revenue bond or COP bond abuses in the state of California? Have we had any?
COP stands for, I know what it
a
is.
Certificate of Participation. I'm sorry, it's provided in some of the material and just refers to COP without explaining it. But have we seen any abuses at all in this state?
Generally, no. I say generally no because I wouldn't represent to you, Senator, that my knowledge of this in a state with 4,200 units of local government would be encyclopedic. But I'm certainly not aware of any high-profile abuses of either approach.
Well, I see you as the smartest man in the room. That's why I'm calling on you. Tim, the capital of Pennsylvania, Harrisburg, was their trash burning facility, was that a revenue bond?
Yes, sir, it is. The Harrisburg incinerator has been somewhat notorious in the annals of municipal finance for about 25 years because of its struggles to pay off its debt to the people who loaned money for its construction and operation.
And then Jefferson County, which filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy, did it because of $4 billion in sewer bonds. Is that correct?
That's correct. And there were some very peculiar circumstances. Actually, the Jefferson County default related to a general obligation pledge rather than a revenue pledge, but the revenues were designated to repay the debt, and in a peculiarity of Alabama law, as I understand it, and I don't want to try to practice law here, the imposition of a tax to support the general obligation pledge required a return to the legislative body of Jefferson County, which apparently they chose not to do.